The boardroom fell silent as Marcus stepped through the glass doors, his presence commanding attention without a word spoken. 23 executives sat around the mahogany table, each one representing millions in revenue, years of experience, and carefully cultivated networks of power. Yet none of them possessed what Marcus had spent the last 15 years developing, the ability to channel raw aggression into surgical precision. This was not the story of a man who conquered through intimidation or manipulation. This was the chronicle of someone who understood that true power comes not from destroying others, but from first destroying the weak version of oneself. Marcus had learned that aggression, when properly mastered, becomes the scalpel of champions rather than the club of tyrants. The transformation had not happened overnight. 5 years earlier, Marcus had been exactly what the world expected from someone with his background: angry, reactive, and destructive. Growing up in the rough neighborhoods of Detroit, aggression had been his primary language. Fists solved problems faster than words, and intimidation opened doors that politeness kept locked. But that version of himself had also cost him everything: relationships, opportunities, and nearly his freedom. The turning point came during a late-night conversation with Dr. Elena Vasquez, a former Special Forces psychologist who had studied the mental frameworks of elite warriors. She had introduced Marcus to a concept that would reshape his understanding of power itself. The difference between villain aggression and hero aggression lies not in intensity, but in purpose and control. A villain uses aggression to take from others, she had explained during their first session. A hero uses aggression to give to others protection, justice, progress. The villain's aggression comes from weakness and fear. The hero's aggression comes from strength and love. Marcus had initially rejected this framework as philosophical nonsense. Aggression was aggression, raw force applied to overcome obstacles. But Dr. Vasquez had challenged him to observe the most successful people in various fields: military leaders, entrepreneurs, athletes, and social reformers. What he discovered changed everything. The Navy SEAL who stormed enemy positions with calculated ferocity did so not to satisfy bloodlust, but to protect innocence and complete missions that saved lives. The entrepreneur who aggressively pursued market domination did so not merely for personal wealth, but to bring innovations that improved millions of lives. The athlete who trained with punishing intensity did so not to crush opponents, but to inspire others to exceed their own limitations. Each of these individuals had learned to harness aggression as a tool of creation rather than destruction. They had developed what Marcus came to understand as heroic aggression, force applied with precision, purpose, and moral clarity. The first principle of heroic aggression became Marcus's foundation: destroy weakness in yourself before it can be exploited by others. This meant identifying every fear, insecurity, bad habit, and limiting belief that made him vulnerable to manipulation or defeat. The process was brutal, requiring him to confront truths about himself that he had spent years avoiding. Marcus discovered that his reactive anger stemmed from deep-seated fear of insignificance. His need to intimidate others grew from his own feelings of powerlessness. His destructive tendencies emerged from his inability to create value in constructive ways. These realizations forced him to wage war against his own weaknesses with the same intensity he had previously directed at external enemies. The psychological research supported this approach. Studies of elite performers across multiple domains revealed that the most successful individuals shared a common trait: they were harder on themselves than any external critic could ever be. They had internalized aggressive self-improvement standards that made external challenges seem manageable by comparison. Dr. Robert Greene's studies of historical power dynamics showed that individuals who mastered themselves first became nearly impossible to defeat through conventional means. When someone had already identified and eliminated their primary vulnerabilities, opponents found no emotional buttons to push, no insecurities to exploit, and no fears to trigger. Marcus began implementing this principle systematically. Each morning started with what he called weakness reconnaissance, an honest assessment of where he felt uncertain, reactive, or defensive. These areas became targets for deliberate improvement. If he felt anxious about public speaking, he signed up for presentation opportunities until confidence replaced fear. If he struggled with financial insecurity, he educated himself about investment strategies and business principles until money became a tool rather than a source of stress. The transformation was not comfortable.
Destroying weak aspects of oneself requires the same ruthless efficiency that military units use to eliminate enemy positions.
There could be no mercy for excuses, no tolerance for self-pity, and no acceptance of limitation that could be overcome through effort and intelligence. But Marcus learned that this internal aggression had to be channeled differently than external aggression. When fighting weakness within himself, the goal was not destruction but reconstruction. He was not trying to eliminate parts of his personality, but to strengthen them until they became assets rather than liabilities. The second principle emerged from studying how elite military units maintained aggression while operating under strict moral codes. Aggression must serve something greater than self-interest. The most dangerous fighters in the world were those who fought for causes beyond themselves: family, country, principles, or missions that transcended personal gain. Marcus began identifying the values and purposes that could legitimately channel his aggressive energy. He found himself drawn to entrepreneurship not just for personal wealth, but for the opportunity to create jobs and solve meaningful problems. He pursued leadership roles not just for status, but for the chance to help others develop their own potential. This shift in motivation created what psychologists call moral courage, the willingness to take aggressive action in service of right principles, even when facing significant opposition. Unlike reactive aggression, which emerges from emotion and often leads to regrettable consequences, moral aggression emerges from clarity and consistently produces results that can be defended long-term. The business world provided Marcus with laboratory conditions for testing these principles. Corporate environments are filled with individuals who use villain aggression, manipulation, backstabbing, credit stealing, and intimidation to advance their careers. But these tactics, while sometimes effective short-term, inevitably create enemies and instability. Marcus chose a different path. He became aggressively helpful, aggressively honest, and aggressively committed to excellence. When colleagues attempted to undermine his projects, he responded not with retaliation but with increased performance. When competitors tried to steal his clients, he responded not with matching their unethical tactics but with superior service and innovation. This approach initially seemed naive to observers. Some colleagues warned that he was being too soft, that business required a willingness to fight dirty to succeed. But Marcus understood something they missed: villain aggression ultimately weakens its practitioners, while hero aggression strengthens them. The man who lies to gain advantage must remember his lies and worry about being exposed. The man who tells the truth has nothing to track or fear. The man who sabotages others creates enemies who will eventually seek revenge. The man who elevates others creates allies who will support his future endeavors. Over time, Marcus's approach began producing superior results. His teams achieved higher performance metrics because members trusted his leadership and felt secure in their roles. His client relationships lasted longer and generated more referrals because they were built on genuine value rather than manipulation. His reputation spread throughout the industry as someone who could be trusted with important projects and sensitive information. The third principle completed his understanding: true aggression is impossible to defend against when it comes from unexpected directions. Villains are predictable because they follow patterns of selfishness and destruction. Heroes become unpredictable because they operate from principles that transcend conventional thinking. Marcus observed that the most effective leaders throughout history had mastered the art of positive surprise. They would show mercy when enemies expected revenge, offer help when competitors expected opposition, and demonstrate strength when others anticipated weakness. This unpredictability came not from randomness but from operating according to higher principles that others could not easily understand or counter. In business negotiations, Marcus began applying this principle by identifying what outcomes would genuinely benefit all parties, then aggressively pursuing those solutions. While opponents prepared for adversarial battles, Marcus consistently offered collaborative victories. This approach disarmed hostility and created opportunities for mutual gain that traditional competitive strategies would have missed. The psychological impact on opponents was profound. When someone prepares for confrontation and instead encounters principled cooperation, their aggressive energy has nowhere to focus. They find themselves responding to moves that benefit them, making it difficult to maintain adversarial positions. But Marcus learned that this approach required genuine strength, not weakness disguised as nobility. The man who offers collaboration from a position of weakness invites exploitation. The man who offers collaboration from a position of strength invites partnership. The difference lies in the ability to choose cooperation rather than being forced into it. This meant developing what military strategists call escalation dominance, the ability to win at any level of conflict, which paradoxically makes conflict unnecessary. Marcus built his skills, resources, and alliances to the point where few rational opponents would choose confrontation over cooperation. But this was not done through threats or intimidation. It was achieved through demonstrated competence and principled behavior. The business presentation that brought him to this boardroom represented the culmination of these principles. Marcus had spent 18 months developing a proposal that would revolutionize supply chain management for the entire industry. The solution would save the company millions while creating thousands of jobs and reducing environmental impact. It was aggressive innovation that served multiple stakeholders simultaneously. As he began his presentation, Marcus embodied everything he had learned about heroic aggression. His research had been thorough to the point of being overwhelming, not because he wanted to show off, but because the complexity of the problem demanded comprehensive solutions. His presentation was direct and forceful, not because he wanted to intimidate, but because clarity served everyone's interests better than diplomatic vagueness. When board members challenged his assumptions, Marcus responded with the intellectual aggression of someone who had tested his ideas against every possible objection. When they questioned his projections, he provided data with the overwhelming force of someone who had verified every number. When they suggested alternative approaches, he demonstrated why his solution was superior with the confidence of someone who had considered and rejected dozens of other options. But, throughout the presentation, Marcus remained focused on service rather than dominance. Every aggressive push was in service of making the proposal clearer, the benefits more obvious, and the implementation more certain. He was not trying to defeat the board members but to equip them with the information they needed to make the best possible decision. The response was unlike anything Marcus had experienced in traditional adversarial business environments. Instead of defensive resistance, he encountered engaged interest. Instead of skeptical questioning, he received strategic collaboration. The board members began building on his ideas rather than tearing them down, because they recognized that his aggression served their interests rather than threatening them. Dr. Vasquez had taught him that this was the ultimate test of heroic aggression: when your force serves others' legitimate interests, they join your force rather than opposing it. The hero aggregates power through alignment, while the villain dissipates power through resistance. The contract Marcus signed that day represented more than business success. It validated a completely different approach to power and influence. By first destroying his own weaknesses, then channeling his aggression toward purposes greater than self-interest, and, finally, making his strength serve others' legitimate needs, he had created what Sun Tzu called victory without battle. But the true transformation had occurred within Marcus himself. The angry young man from Detroit was gone, replaced by someone who understood that real strength comes from having nothing left to prove and everything to contribute. The process of destroying his weak self had not eliminated his aggression, it had refined it into something far more powerful and productive. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has already eliminated the vulnerabilities that external enemies depend on for their attacks. Fear cannot be weaponized against someone who has faced and conquered their deepest fears. Insecurity cannot be exploited by someone who has built genuine competence. Anger cannot be triggered in someone who has learned to channel rage into constructive action. This internal invulnerability creates external opportunities that would be impossible to achieve through traditional aggressive approaches. When others cannot manipulate your emotions, they must engage with your ideas. When they cannot exploit your weaknesses, they must acknowledge your strengths. When they cannot predict your behavior based on selfish patterns, they must respect your principles. Marcus had learned that the ultimate form of aggression is becoming someone that others want to follow rather than someone they feel compelled to resist. This requires the kind of internal work that most people avoid because it demands confronting uncomfortable truths about themselves. But those willing to undertake this aggressive self-improvement develop capabilities that transform every subsequent interaction. The second part of Marcus's journey involved learning to apply these principles beyond individual success toward building systems and organizations that embodied heroic aggression. If personal transformation was the foundation, cultural transformation was the structure that could be built upon that foundation. Marcus's first opportunity to test organizational applications came when he was promoted to regional director for his company's East Coast operations. The region had been underperforming for 3 consecutive years, with high employee turnover, declining client satisfaction, and persistent internal conflicts between departments. Traditional management approaches might have focused on identifying and punishing poor performers, implementing new oversight systems, or restructuring departments to force better collaboration. These methods represent institutional villain aggression, using organizational power to compel compliance through fear of consequences. Instead, Marcus applied the principles he had learned about heroic aggression at the organizational level. Just as he had first destroyed weaknesses within himself, he began identifying and eliminating systemic weaknesses that made the organization vulnerable to poor performance and internal dysfunction. The root analysis revealed that most problems stemmed from misaligned incentives rather than incompetent people. Sales teams were rewarded for volume regardless of client fit, leading to overpromises that operations teams could not deliver. Operations teams were measured on efficiency metrics that encouraged cutting corners on quality. Customer service teams had no authority to solve problems, creating frustration for both employees and clients. Rather than attacking symptoms through increased oversight and punishment, Marcus aggressively redesigned the incentive structure to align individual success with organizational success. Sales commissions became tied to long-term client satisfaction scores. Operations bonuses reflected quality metrics alongside efficiency measures. Customer service representatives received both authority and rewards for creative problem-solving. The psychological principle underlying this approach reflected Marcus's understanding of human nature. People naturally act aggressively in pursuit of their interests, but organizational dysfunction occurs when individual interests conflict with collective interests. By aligning these interests, individual aggression automatically served organizational goals. The transformation required what Marcus called aggressive patience, the willingness to invest significant time and resources in solutions that would pay dividends over months or years rather than immediately. This meant enduring short-term criticism from stakeholders who wanted immediate results while building foundations for sustainable long-term improvement. Marcus had learned this principle from studying military special operations units, which spend far more time in training and preparation than in actual combat missions. The patience to prepare thoroughly enables overwhelming effectiveness when action becomes necessary. Organizational change follows similar patterns. Extensive preparation enables rapid implementation when conditions are right. The regional turnaround took 18 months, but the results validated Marcus's approach. Employee satisfaction scores increased by 47%, client retention improved by 32%, and revenue grew by 55%. More importantly, these improvements were sustainable because they resulted from systemic changes rather than heroic individual efforts. But the experience taught Marcus that organizational heroic aggression required different skills than individual heroic aggression. Leading organizational change meant influencing people who had not chosen to undergo personal transformation. Many employees initially resisted changes that would ultimately benefit them because change itself felt threatening. This resistance forced Marcus to develop what he termed educational aggression, the persistent, overwhelming effort to help others understand how proposed changes serve their interests. Rather than using authority to force compliance, he invested enormous energy in communication, training, and demonstration until resistance transformed into enthusiastic participation. The process required psychological sophistication that went beyond traditional leadership training. Marcus had to understand each person's fears, motivations, and aspirations well enough to connect organizational changes to individual benefits in ways that felt authentic and compelling to each person. Dr. Vasquez had taught him that this was one of the most challenging applications of heroic aggression because it required maintaining unwavering focus on others' well-being even when they interpreted his efforts as threats. The natural human tendency is to respond to resistance with increased force, but heroic aggression demands increased understanding. Marcus developed a systematic approach to this challenge. When employees expressed concerns about new policies or procedures, he treated each concern as valuable intelligence about potential problems rather than as opposition to be overcome. This approach led to numerous improvements in implementation plans and helped employees feel heard rather than ignored. The success of the regional transformation attracted attention from corporate headquarters, leading to Marcus's promotion to vice president of organizational development for the entire company. This role provided opportunities to test his principles on a much larger scale, with over 12,000 employees across 15 countries. The complexity of global organizational change demanded everything Marcus had learned about heroic aggression while requiring new applications he had not previously considered. Cultural differences meant that approaches which worked effectively in American business environments might be misinterpreted or ineffective in Asian or European contexts. Marcus spent 6 months traveling to every regional office, not to impose standardized solutions but to understand how heroic aggression principles could be expressed authentically within different cultural frameworks. He discovered that while specific tactics varied significantly across cultures, the underlying principles of serving others' legitimate interests while maintaining principled strength translated universally. In Japan, heroic aggression manifested through meticulous attention to continuous improvement and collective harmony. In Germany, it appeared as relentless pursuit of engineering excellence and systematic problem solving. In Brazil, it emerged through passionate commitment to innovation and collaborative energy. This cultural education taught Marcus that heroic aggression was not a fixed set of behaviors but an underlying orientation that could be expressed through countless different approaches. The key was maintaining focus on principles, serving others, building strength through self-improvement, and channeling force toward constructive purposes rather than copying specific tactics. The global transformation initiative that Marcus ultimately designed reflected this understanding. Rather than implementing uniform policies across all regions, he created frameworks that enabled each regional team to develop solutions appropriate to their cultural context while maintaining alignment with core principles. The framework focused on 3 universal elements that transcended cultural differences: eliminating systemic obstacles to employee success, aligning individual incentives with organizational goals, and building capabilities that enabled creative problem-solving at every level. Each region was challenged to identify the specific obstacles, misalignments, and capability gaps that prevented their teams from achieving exceptional performance. But they were also given resources, authority, and support to develop solutions that fit their unique circumstances. This approach required Marcus to practice perhaps the most difficult form of heroic aggression, the discipline to focus on outcomes rather than methods. Traditional command and control leadership feels safer because it provides the illusion of control through standardized processes. But Marcus had learned that true control comes from empowering others to achieve shared objectives through their own creativity and initiative. The results exceeded even Marcus's optimistic projections. Employee engagement scores reached company records in every region. Customer satisfaction improved globally. Revenue growth accelerated while operational costs decreased. But, most significantly, the improvements continued accelerating over time as regional teams built on their initial successes with increasing confidence and capability. Marcus realized that he had created something unprecedented in his experience, an organization that embodied heroic aggression at the cultural level. The company had developed the institutional equivalent of personal invulnerability systems and capabilities that made it nearly impossible for competitors to exploit weaknesses or create disruptions. This organizational invulnerability emerged from the same principle that created personal invulnerability: proactive elimination of weaknesses before they could be exploited. But, at the organizational level, this meant building redundant capabilities, maintaining strong relationships with all stakeholders, and continuously improving faster than problems could develop. The third phase of Marcus's journey involved understanding how heroic aggression principles could be applied beyond individual and organizational success toward broader social impact. If personal transformation was the foundation and organizational transformation was the structure, societal contribution was the purpose that justified both earlier phases. This realization came during a conversation with Maria Santos, a social entrepreneur who had built educational programs that transformed communities throughout Latin America. Maria challenged Marcus to consider whether his business success was creating broader social value or simply concentrating resources more efficiently within existing systems. "You've learned to win without creating losers within your organization," Maria observed, "but
Have you considered whether your industry creates losers in society? True heroic aggression should strengthen the entire ecosystem, not just your piece of it.
The question forced Marcus to examine his industry's impact on communities, environment, and economic inequality. What he discovered was troubling. While his company had become more ethical and effective, the supply chain management industry as a whole continued contributing to environmental degradation, labor exploitation, and economic concentration that weakened local communities. Marcus faced a choice that would determine whether his understanding of heroic aggression was complete or merely sophisticated selfishness. He could continue optimizing within existing systems, achieving personal and organizational success while ignoring broader impacts. Or he could apply heroic aggression principles to challenge systemic problems that required solutions beyond any single organization's capabilities. The decision required him to confront the deepest level of personal weakness, the comfort and security that came from working within established systems rather than challenging them. Marcus realized that he had eliminated many personal vulnerabilities but had not yet developed the courage to risk his accumulated success in service of broader principles. This internal confrontation proved more difficult than his earlier self-improvement efforts because the stakes were higher and the outcomes less certain. Challenging industry-wide practices meant risking relationships, reputation, and financial security that had taken years to build. But Marcus had learned that heroic aggression demands moving toward greater challenges rather than retreating to comfort zones. The principle of destroying weakness within oneself applied to this situation. If fear of loss prevented him from pursuing right action, then that fear represented a weakness that needed to be eliminated. He began developing what would become known as the Industry Transformation Initiative, a collaborative effort to redesign supply chain practices around principles of environmental sustainability, labor justice, and community development. The initiative required convincing competitors to cooperate on changes that would initially reduce short-term profits in exchange for long-term industry stability and social legitimacy. The project demanded every skill Marcus had developed about heroic aggression while requiring new applications he had not previously considered. Convincing entire industries to change established practices required understanding the fears, incentives, and constraints that shaped corporate decision-making at levels far beyond individual organizations. Marcus discovered that industry transformation required what military strategists called strategic patience, the ability to maintain aggressive pursuit of objectives across timeframes measured in years or decades rather than quarters or fiscal years. This meant building coalitions, changing regulations, shifting consumer expectations, and developing new technologies simultaneously across multiple fronts. The complexity forced Marcus to collaborate with experts in fields far beyond his business experience: environmental scientists, labor economists, community organizers, policy researchers, and international development specialists. Each collaboration taught him new applications of heroic aggression principles within different professional contexts. Environmental scientists taught him that aggressive environmental protection required thinking in systems and timescales that transcended traditional business planning. Meaningful environmental improvement demanded changes that would pay dividends across generations rather than fiscal years. Labor economists helped him understand that sustainable business models required creating genuine value for workers rather than simply minimizing labor costs. Companies that invested aggressively in employee development and fair compensation ultimately achieved superior performance because they attracted better talent and generated stronger commitment. Community organizers showed him how grassroots change movements applied heroic aggression principles through patient, persistent effort to build understanding and consensus around shared values. Effective organizing required the same focus on serving others' legitimate interests that Marcus had learned in business contexts. The Industry Transformation Initiative ultimately succeeded beyond Marcus's initial goals, but the victory took 7 years and required learning forms of heroic aggression that he had not previously imagined. The success came not through defeating opposition but through creating alternatives that were so obviously superior that resistance became difficult to justify. The transformed supply chain standards that emerged from the initiative reduced environmental impact by 43% while creating 27,000 new jobs in participating communities. Companies that adopted the new standards achieved better financial performance than competitors who maintained traditional practices. But Marcus learned that this kind of systemic change required personal sacrifices that tested his commitment to heroic aggression principles. The initiative demanded enormous time, energy, and financial investment with no guarantee of success. There were periods when Marcus questioned whether the effort was worthwhile, especially when facing criticism from colleagues who thought he was risking everything for idealistic goals. The persistence required to continue during these difficult periods taught Marcus the final lesson about heroic aggression. True strength comes from commitment to principles that transcend personal benefit or recognition. The man who destroys his weak self ultimately discovers that his strong self is connected to purposes larger than individual success. This discovery completed Marcus's understanding of the difference between villain aggression and hero aggression. Villains ultimately serve their own interests, which means their power is limited by their personal capacities and lifespans. Heroes serve principles and purposes that transcend individual limitations, which means their power can grow beyond personal boundaries through the influence they have on others. The boardroom where Marcus's journey began represented just one moment in a continuing process of applying heroic aggression to increasingly complex challenges. Each success created opportunities to tackle more significant problems. Each problem solved revealed additional problems that required more sophisticated solutions. Marcus had learned that the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that external enemies require for their attacks. But, more importantly, he had discovered that this internal strength creates opportunities to strengthen others, organizations, industries, and, ultimately, society itself. The true power of heroic aggression lies not in individual invulnerability but in the capacity to help others develop their own strength. When someone has eliminated their own weaknesses, they can help others identify and overcome their weaknesses. When someone has learned to channel aggression toward constructive purposes, they can teach others the same skills. This teaching function represents the highest application of heroic aggression because it multiplies impact beyond individual capabilities. Every person who learns to destroy their weak self and channel their strength toward serving others creates exponential increases in positive force within society. Marcus's story illustrates these principles but does not exhaust their applications. The frameworks he learned can be applied by anyone willing to undertake the difficult work of honest self-examination and principled action. The specific tactics will vary based on individual circumstances, cultural contexts, and chosen fields of endeavor, but the underlying principles remain constant. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has built strength that does not depend on external validation or protection. But this strength only achieves its full potential when channeled toward purposes that serve others and strengthen the systems within which everyone must operate. Heroic aggression represents a complete philosophy of power that transcends traditional categories of competition and cooperation. It enables individuals to achieve exceptional results while building rather than depleting the resources available to others. It creates victory without requiring others to experience defeat. The current global challenges, environmental degradation, economic inequality, political polarization, technological disruption, require solutions that embody heroic aggression principles. These problems cannot be solved through villain aggression that seeks to win at others' expense. They demand collaborative force applied persistently toward outcomes that benefit all stakeholders. Marcus's transformation from angry young man to industry leader to social entrepreneur demonstrates that these principles can be learned and applied by anyone willing to undertake the necessary internal work. The process is not easy, but it is possible for anyone who chooses development over comfort, service over selfishness, and principles over convenience. The ultimate invitation of heroic aggression is to become someone who makes everyone around them stronger rather than weaker, more capable rather than more dependent, more hopeful rather than more fearful. This requires destroying the parts of ourselves that seek power through dominance and developing the parts that find power through contribution. The man who completes this transformation discovers that he has become truly indestructible not because he can defeat any enemy, but because he has eliminated the internal enemies that make external enemies possible. He has learned to strike like a hero rather than a villain, which means his force creates rather than destroys, builds rather than tears down, and strengthens rather than weakens everything it touches. This is the ultimate mastery of aggression, converting raw force into creative power that serves life rather than death, growth rather than decay, hope rather than fear. It represents perhaps the most important skill that can be developed in a world that desperately needs more heroes and fewer villains, more builders and fewer destroyers, more leaders who serve and fewer who exploit. The choice between villain aggression and hero aggression is available to everyone in every moment. The difference lies not in the intensity of force applied but in the purposes that force serves and the principles that guide its application. Master this distinction, and you master not just aggression but the fundamental dynamics of power itself.